Seattle General in Raleigh hums with the particular kind of quiet that only exists in hospitals at shift change. Fluorescent lights cast everything in that flat white glow that makes time feel suspended, and the antiseptic smell hangs thick enough to taste. Katie Morrison moves through the ER like water finding its level, her movements precise and economical, wasting nothing. She's been here 2 years. Long enough to know where the extra blankets are kept in Trauma Bay 3, long enough for the residents to ask her opinion without hesitation, not long enough for anyone to ask the real questions. Dr. Pierce arrives at the nurses' station at 2:22 p.m. with Katie's personnel file already in his hands. He'd requested it that morning, routine credentials verification, he'd told the HR director, but his eyes move across her application documents like a man reading a confession he's been waiting years to hear. Community college. Not Johns Hopkins. Not Penn. Not Mayo. Community college and then straight into the nursing track at a state university. His jaw tightens as he reads. The kind of tightness that comes from discovering something that offends the natural order of things. He stands there for 45 seconds holding that file, long enough for the nurses at the station to notice him noticing. Long enough for the shift supervisor to glance up from her computer. Long enough for Katie to feel the weight of his attention from across the trauma bay where she's checking 4 lines on an incoming patient. She doesn't look back. This is the first rule she learned when she took this job: don't meet a challenge in the eyes unless you're ready to finish it. She's not ready. Or rather, she's not willing. Willing is a choice she made 15 years ago and has been keeping to every single day since. The patient in Trauma Bay 3 is a 42-year-old male, admitted 4 hours ago with sepsis, his blood pressure dropping despite 2 rounds of broad-spectrum antibiotics and aggressive fluid resuscitation. His name is Marcus Webb and he's terrified. Katie can see it in how his hands grip the bed rails, in how his eyes track her movements like she's the only solid thing in a dissolving world. She places a hand on his shoulder as she enters the bay, just a touch, just enough to say I'm here. The gesture takes half a second. I need a central line, Dr. Pierce says from the doorway. He's still holding her file. Now. It's not a request. It's a performance. Katie hears it in how he pitches his voice just loud enough for the other staff members to hear. This is the opening move of a game she doesn't remember agreeing to play. She nods, doesn't speak, turns to gather supplies. Sterile field kit. 18-gauge needle. Guide wire. A 7 French triple-lumen catheter. She's done this procedure 247 times in her career. She's done it in conditions that would make this fluorescent-lit trauma bay look like a 5-star resort. The internal jugular vein is her target. She preps the site with chlorhexidine, the sharp chemical smell cutting through the antiseptic. Drapes go down. Sterile field established. Her hands move with the kind of economy that comes from doing something so many times your body remembers it before your brain catches up. This is muscle memory. This is the kind of precision that can't be taught in any classroom. She positions the ultrasound probe. The vein appears on screen, dark, patent, exactly where it should be. She localizes with the small gauge finder needle first, always checking. The principle is simple. The execution is art. She advances the 18-gauge. There's that slight resistance as the needle punctures skin, muscle, then the sudden give as it enters the vessel. She threads the guide wire through, removes the needle, and begins dilating the tract with a series of progressively larger sheaths. The whole procedure takes 4 minutes. 4 minutes from incision to confirmation. She places the final catheter with a soft click and immediately draws back, watching blood return through each lumen in perfect synchronization. She flushes each port with normal saline. The central line is placed. Radiographic confirmation will come later, but she knows it's good. She's known since the wire went in that this placement is perfect. Dr. Pierce watches from the doorway the entire time. Katie can feel his attention like a pressure, like the barometric drop before a storm rolls in. When she finishes, when she steps back and removes her gloves in that particular way that makes the latex snap like a gunshot, he's still standing there. Watching. Calculating. Good work, Dr. Patterson says. He's the attending surgeon, late 60s, trained at Johns Hopkins in the 80s, and he means it. He's watched that procedure from start to finish and he knows what he's looking at. That was textbook. Katie doesn't acknowledge the compliment. Instead, she says, I binged too much Grey's Anatomy. All those dramatic central lines stuck in my head. She delivers it with a self-deprecating smile, the kind that disarms, the kind that says I'm just doing my job like everyone else. The kind that makes people look away so she can disappear again. But Dr. Pierce doesn't look away. His eyes move from Katie to Dr. Patterson and back again, cataloguing the moment like it's evidence. Like it's proof of something he suspected. The file is still in his hands. Her transcripts. Her background. Her clearly visible inadequacy for this level of work written right there in her educational history. Except her hands don't show inadequacy. Her hands show something else entirely. Later, at shift change, Katie opens her locker. The photo of her daughter is still there, taped inside the door. Emma, 8 years old, missing her top 2 teeth, smiling at a beach in North Carolina that Katie took her to 2 months ago. Emma doesn't know why her mother sometimes wakes up gasping at 3 in the morning. Emma doesn't know why there are certain sounds on the television that make her mother go very still. Emma knows that her mother loves her and comes home every day and makes pancakes on Sunday mornings. That has to be enough. Underneath the photo, buried beneath folded scrubs and protein bars, is a sealed cardboard box. The box contains a flag. Not just any flag. A flag that's been folded by hands that knew the protocol, that understood the weight of what they were folding. The fabric is worn at the edges. The creases are softened from being held. Katie touches the box once, just once, before closing the locker door. Dr. Pierce doesn't know about the box. He doesn't know about the flag or what it represents or who it belonged to. He knows only that her transcripts don't match her performance, and that discrepancy is a problem that needs solving. People like Dr. Pierce, Ivy League educated, credentialed from the right institutions, connected to the right families, they understand one thing clearly: hierarchy is earned through the right pedigree. Everything else is accident. Everything else is luck that will eventually run out. The next morning Katie is prepping supplies in the medication room when she overhears 2 nurses talking in the hallway. The conversation dies the moment they see her, which is exactly how these things work. The silence lasts half a second. Just long enough to confirm that the conversation was about her. Just long enough for her to understand that Dr. Pierce has started something. She doesn't react. She doesn't ask what they were saying. She finishes counting the 10 milliliter syringes and moves to the next task. Her hands don't shake. Her breathing doesn't change. This is a skill she learned a long time ago, the ability to absorb a blow without showing the impact. The ability to keep moving forward while something is setting itself in motion behind you. By the end of the week, 3 residents request to work with her specifically during their emergency medicine rotation. By the end of the following week, the surgical nurses have begun asking her to assist on the complex cases. By the end of the 3rd week, there's a quiet reputation developing that Katie Morrison, the community college nurse, somehow knows things that shouldn't be possible. The way she anticipates what a surgeon needs before they ask for it. The way her hands move through procedures with the kind of precision usually reserved for those with expensive degrees hanging on expensive walls. Dr. Pierce notices. He watches from the observation window as Katie works a thoracotomy on a trauma patient, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who's performed this procedure under circumstances that would make a civilian surgeon weep. She's not the surgeon here, Dr. Patterson is, but she's assisting with a kind of competence that makes her invisible until you really look. And Dr. Pierce looks. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is what happens when Dr. Pierce begins to understand that she didn't just pass through a trauma program. The worst part is understanding that her hands carry a kind of knowledge that doesn't come from textbooks or simulation labs or instructional YouTube videos. The worst part is standing in the observation window of Seattle General in Raleigh and realizing that the quiet nurse with the community college transcripts might know something about true emergency medicine that he, with all his credentials and all his connections and all his carefully curated authority, will never actually understand. He doesn't know her name. Not really. He doesn't know that her daughter draws pictures of birds at school, or that Katie keeps every single one of them in a folder in her nightstand. He doesn't know that on certain mornings, Katie wakes at 4 a.m. and goes to the gym and runs on the treadmill while watching the news with the sound off, afraid of what she might hear. He doesn't know that the way her hands move through a procedure is because those hands have held human beings together in circumstances that would destroy most people. He only knows that she's a threat. And Dr. Pierce has spent his entire career managing threats. Dr. Pierce positioned himself at the entrance to Trauma Bay 3 like a wolf watching wounded prey. The 16-year-old gunshot victim was already on the gurney, his parents pressed against the glass partition, the mother's hand covering her mouth, the father's face collapsing in that way that meant he'd stopped breathing correctly. Katie moved through the controlled chaos with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, her hand steady as surgical lasers as she prepped the four-line and reached for the morphine vial. 8 milligrams, she said to the resident, already calculating the boy's weight, his pain scale assessment, the hemorrhagic shock creeping into his vital signs like a thief. Push slow. Dr. Pierce stepped forward. His voice cut through the trauma bay like a scalpel through silk. Nurse Morrison, explain your rationale for 8 milligrams when protocol clearly states 5 milligrams for pediatric trauma patients. The room didn't freeze. No one gasped. This was Seattle General, and Dr. Pierce had been here 8 years, had built a reputation on Ivy League credentials and the kind of authority that made people's spines straighten without thinking. But Katie didn't look up from the medication line. She continued the push with absolute control. 168 pounds, she said, her voice flat as a radar screen. Pain scale 9 out of 10. Hemorrhagic shock protocol section 4.2 permits dosage adjustment for patient weight and pain assessment. He's not pediatric at that mass. Pierce's jaw tightened. He'd expected deference. He'd expected the kind of hesitation that came from someone who knew they didn't belong. Your community college training is showing again, clipboard Katie. He turned slightly, making sure the parents heard this clearly. Perhaps if you'd attended an actual medical program, you'd understand that protocol exists for a reason. Not for improvisation by staff nurses who think they've discovered something the hospital's physicians have somehow missed. The mother's hand dropped from her mouth. The father's eyes narrowed. The resident looked at his shoes. Katie finished the push and set the syringe down with a soft click against the medication tray. Then she turned to face Dr. Pierce, and every person in that trauma bay felt the temperature drop. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds over an empty ocean, and when she spoke, her voice sounded like ice in a glass. Your insecurity is showing, doctor. She paused, letting the words sit. Maybe tuck it back in before rounds. She turned and walked out of the trauma bay without waiting for a response. Without checking the boy's oxygen saturation one more time. Without any of the small rituals of deference that nurses were supposed to perform when they challenged a physician's authority. She simply walked away, leaving Dr. Pierce standing there with his face flushing crimson and the resident suddenly very interested in the ventilator settings. The parents looked at each other. The mother reached for the father's hand. 2 days later, Katie entered the break room with her lunch in a paper bag, a container of rice and vegetables, the same thing she'd been eating for 3 weeks. The 5 nurses sitting at the large table mid-conversation went silent in synchronized waves. One of them, Sandra, who'd complimented Katie's work just last week, literally stopped mid-sentence about weekend plans and stared down at her coffee. Another nurse's phone suddenly demanded her absolute attention, fingers flying across the screen as if urgent messages were dropping in by the second. The remaining 3 nurses didn't even look up, but the conversation that had been flowing like a river simply dried up, leaving only the ambient sounds of the hospital, the distant code alarm, the ventilator in a nearby room, the fluorescent lights buzzing their endless electronic hum. Katie sat at the corner table, alone, and opened her container of rice. She ate in silence. But she could hear them now, the whispered conversations resuming behind her, fragments that stitched together like a pattern. Think she's special and getting too big for her scrubs, and who does she think she is, talking to Dr. Pierce like that and probably trying to make the rest of us look bad? The words were sharp little needles, and none of them landed. She chewed her rice and looked out the break room window at Raleigh stretched out below Seattle General, the city moving in its ordinary way, and felt nothing at all. The third day came and went. Then came the fourth morning, when Katie arrived for her shift and found it posted on the unit board, printed on official hospital letterhead, her name centered at the top in black ink. The write-up. Dr. Pierce's signature at the bottom, precise and authoritative as a gavel strike. Formal performance notice, it read. Citation of 18 procedural deviations, each one listed with meticulous care, unauthorized medication adjustments, failure to consult attending physicians on trauma protocols, persistent boundary violations with surgical staff, conduct unbecoming of hospital standards, and 6 more infractions that made it sound as if Katie had been conducting surgery in the stairwell with a butter knife. Every nurse walking past the board that morning paused to read it. Every nurse's eyes flicked toward her as she stood at the nurse's station reviewing charts, her face showing nothing at all. And every one of them was acutely aware that Dr. Pierce was watching from his office window 20 feet away, his expression satisfied, the kind of satisfaction that comes from drawing first blood in a war no one had formally declared. The technique was brilliant, really. The paper trail. The official documentation. The witnesses. If Katie complained, it would look like retaliation. If she ignored it, it would accumulate, layer upon layer of complaint, building a foundation for something much worse. Dr. Pierce had spent 22 years climbing the hospital hierarchy, and he understood institutional power the way musicians understand instruments, every note a calculated move, every silence a threat. But that wasn't the worst part. That was the beginning. The emergency alert came in at 8:22 a.m. on a Thursday, the kind of call that made everyone's spine straighten. Major trauma incoming, ETA 7 minutes, Army Ranger, training accident, Fort Bragg, tension pneumothorax. The radio crackled with urgency as the trauma team assembled, and Katie was already moving before the dispatcher finished the sentence, her hands reaching for the equipment she'd need before anyone asked for it. A 14-gauge angiocath needle. The thoracotomy tray. The crash cart positioned exactly where it would need to be. The ambulance arrived with Captain Ryan Marsh on the gurney, his breath coming in gasps, his chest asymmetrical, one lung collapsed like a failed building. 42, muscular, the kind of man whose hands had learned to operate under pressure, and he was drowning in his own chest cavity while 5 nurses and 2 residents tried to organize themselves into something resembling a team. Katie took lead. No one questioned it. Her voice dropped an octave, and when she moved, everything else arranged itself around her like iron filings around a magnet. 2 large-bore 4s, type O negative, 7 units on standby. Oxygen saturation is dropping, hit him with high-flow rebreather, 100%. Get me a 16 gauge for the needle decompression, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The resident fumbled with equipment, and Katie simply reached past him without a word, her movements so smooth and practiced that they didn't register as interruption, they registered as the way things were supposed to happen. She prepped the chest tube site with antiseptic, and the smell of it rose up, that sharp, clean, chemical scent that meant business was about to happen. Marsh's eyes opened. Through the morphine haze and the suffocation and the animal panic that came with not being able to breathe, his eyes found hers. His hand shot up with surprising strength and grabbed her wrist just as she positioned the scalpel. His grip was like a vice made of tendons and experience. Hindu Kush, he rasped, each word dragged up through lungs that weren't working. You were the medic. They called you Phantom. Everything in the trauma bay stopped. The resident's hands froze. The monitor's beeping seemed to get louder, filling the sudden vacuum of silence. Katie's face didn't change, not a flicker of recognition, not a twitch at the corner of her mouth, but her hands hesitated. Half a second. An eternity in her world, the kind of hesitation that meant something catastrophic had just happened. She looked down at Marsh's face, then back up to the scalpel in her hand. You're confusing me with someone else, "Captain," she said quietly, her voice wrapped in ice so thick you could operate in it. And then, barely audible, "Please. Stop." But the word wasn't please the way nurses learned it in nursing school. It was the kind of please that came from someone who'd learned how to ask for things in places where the answer could kill you. Where forgetting someone's name meant they came back at night. Where the wrong word could unravel a year of work building a new life, a new identity, a new version of yourself that didn't carry 17 body bags and 3 senators' sons and a folded flag in the back of a closet. She inserted the chest tube with one hand, her technique so efficient it looked like choreography rather than emergency intervention. The needle went in. The hiss of released pressure filled the trauma bay, and the monitor's oxygen saturation began climbing, 68, 72, 78, 84. The boy's breathing eased. His color improved. The panic in his parents' eyes shifted to cautious hope. Marsh kept watching her through morphine-heavy eyes. His lips moved again, forming the word phantom like a question, like a prayer, like a betrayal of something sacred. The sedative took him under before he could ask again. The trauma resolved. The boy stabilized. Katie wheeled him to ICU without making eye contact with anyone, and when she came back down to the nurse's station, she found the background audit form sitting on her desk like a coiled snake. Routine hospital procedure. Standard credentialing review. Dr. Pierce's signature authorizing it. The timing was not a coincidence. The resident who'd been in the trauma bay pulled Katie aside at shift change, his voice low and urgent. "That patient. What he said. I heard it. The other nurses heard it. Do you want me to?" "No," Katie said. Her voice was back to normal now, deferential again, the careful syntax of someone who knows how to make themselves smaller. "It's fine." He was on morphine. Delirious. People say things when they're oxygen deprived. But her hands, when she thought no one was looking, had clenched into fists. The ambulance bay doors swung open at 14:19, and Katie Morrison knew exactly what she was looking at before the stretcher cleared the threshold. Tension pneumothorax. The patient's right lung collapsed like a deflated balloon, his body compensating with every ragged breath, and his skin carried that telltale grey-blue pallor of someone whose oxygen was running out. The paramedic rattled off vitals with practiced urgency. Captain Ryan Marsh, 34, fell 60 feet from a rappel line at Fort Bragg, tension pneumo on the right, BP dropping. We've got 2 minutes before full cardiovascular collapse. Katie was already moving. Not running, never running, but walking with a kind of efficient grace that made nurses 3 years into their career look like they were flailing. Her hands were steady as she grabbed the surgical tray, muscle memory pulling the 14-gauge angiocath needle like her fingers had been doing this yesterday instead of 15 years ago. The ER attending, Dr. Sarah Chen, nodded at her. Chen had learned long ago not to question Katie's anticipatory movements. She was there with exactly what was needed before you asked. Captain Marsh's eyes found Katie's as they wheeled toward Trauma Bay 3. His pupils were blown wide, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his body already shutting down from lack of oxygen. But something flickered in those eyes, a moment of recognition so sudden it was like watching a light switch flip in a dark room. His hand shot out with surprising strength for a man in shock and grabbed Katie's wrist mid-motion, the angiocath needle inches from his chest wall. "Hindu Kush," he rasped, his voice barely audible beneath the ventilator hiss and monitor beeping. "You were the medic. They called you Phantom." The room didn't freeze. That was the thing nobody understood about crisis moments, they didn't pause. They accelerated. The paramedics kept moving. Dr. Chen kept barking orders. The monitors kept their relentless electronic screaming. But Katie's hands hesitated. 1/2 second. The kind of hesitation that lasts a lifetime when you're trying to stay invisible. She didn't look at him. She looked at his chest, at the place where his lung was collapsing, at the clinical problem that needed solving. Her face was a flat, professional mask. But her eyes begged him to let go. To forget. To take whatever piece of the past his oxygen-starved brain was conjuring and release it back into the dark. "You're confusing me with someone else, Captain," she whispered, and her voice was exactly what a skilled ER nurse sounded like. Calm. Competent. Detached. The voice of someone who'd never held a rifle. Never watched a teammate bleed out into the dust of Cunha province. Never made decisions in 30 seconds that would haunt her for 3 decades. His grip loosened. Maybe it was the hypoxia finally winning. Maybe it was something in her voice. Katie didn't know. She didn't let herself think about it. She did what came next. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping, that particular sound of a lung re-inflating, pressure equalizing, a body getting a second chance. O2 sat climbing. 68, 73. 81, stable. Captain Marsh's grip on her wrist released, his arm falling back to the stretcher as his pupils began to shrink, his breathing deepening as oxygen flooded into tissue that had been starving for it. "Get him to surgery," Katie said to Dr. Chen, and her voice was back to normal. Just a nurse. Competent. Deferential. The kind of nurse who anticipated needs but didn't ask questions. The next 4 hours were routine in the way that only a chest trauma could be routine. Katie stayed 3 steps behind, handing instruments to the surgical team, monitoring vitals, catching problems before they became catastrophes. She moved like someone fluent in a language most civilians never learned, the grammar of trauma, the syntax of survival, the vocabulary of hands that had once held people together in places where helicopters couldn't reach and the nearest hospital was 1,000 kilometers away. Dr. Pierce didn't arrive until the closing sutures were going in. He appeared in the doorway of the surgical suite like a stage entrance, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the scene with the intensity of someone looking for confirmation of something he'd already decided. Katie was adjusting the bear hugger warming blanket across Captain Marsh's chest, making sure his core temperature wouldn't drop into dangerous territory. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge his presence. She'd learned long ago that the best way to stay invisible was to be so useful that people forgot to see you. But Dr. Pierce saw her. He saw the way her hands moved with precision that transcended any community college training. He saw the surgical team deferring to her when she mentioned the pericardial fragment they'd almost missed, a small piece of rib that had shifted during the initial trauma and would have caused catastrophic bleeding if they'd closed without removing it. He saw the way she handled the post-op care with the casual authority of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. And his face shifted. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved from admiration to something harder. Something that looked like vindication. By 1742, he was in his office on the hospital's 4th floor. Katie learned this later, but the timeline mattered. He made calls to the medical board, her medical board, the one that had been looking for a reason to review her file for the past 3 months. He called the hospital attorney. He called risk management. He called people Katie had never even met, and he said words like scope of practice violation and unauthorized surgical intervention and patient consent breach with the practice certainty of someone who'd been building this case in his head for weeks. The form started appearing on his desk. Medical board complaint form. Scope of practice violation report. Incident summary for the legal department. Each one was a perfect document, each one was meticulous, and by evening they were stacked 3 inches thick, a tower of bureaucratic ammunition with Katie's name on every page. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he was right about one thing: she had performed a procedure she wasn't technically authorized to perform. She had done it to save a life. She had done it with hands that remembered every stitch, every clamp, every decision made under fire. And now that decision was going to be weaponized against her. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electronic drone as Dr. Pierce made call number 8. His voice was calm. Reasonable. He was just a concerned director protecting his hospital's credibility. He was just someone who believed in proper protocols. He was just a man who'd finally found a way to make someone invisible become visible, but only in the context of a mistake. Captain Marsh's vitals stabilized through the evening shift. His oxygen saturation stayed above 94%. His heart rate remained steady. By any clinical measure, he was exactly where he needed to be. But Katie didn't see him again that day. By the time visiting hours ended and the evening nurses were settling into their routines, the paperwork had already begun its quiet journey through the hospital's administrative system. Complaint forms. Documentation. Evidence. Nobody told her. Not yet. In the ER, you learn to work in the spaces between what people said and what they meant. Katie had become expert at reading silence. 48 hours of stability became 48 hours of routine. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. Captain Marsh's color had improved, pink returning to his fingertips, oxygen saturation holding at 94% on minimal support. The surgical team had come and gone, satisfied with her needle decompression, though none of them asked her name. Katie changed his dressing during the afternoon shift, her movements precise and unhurried. One hand steadied his shoulder while the other peeled away the old gauze. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something copper underneath, old blood, fading. She'd done this 10,000 times before, though never in a civilian hospital with fluorescent lights and insurance forms. The new dressing went on in silence. Smooth. Clean. The kind of work that should have been invisible. It wasn't. The cardiac monitor began its warning beep at 2:06 p.m., a rhythm that shouldn't exist, a pattern that meant something had shifted inside his chest. Not the external wound. Something deeper. Something missed. Marsh's eyes snapped open and his back arched against the mattress as his blood pressure dropped in real time, 110/68, then 95/52, then 80/40 and falling. His face went grey. The monitor escalated from beep to wail, a sound like panic made audible, and Katie was moving before anyone else recognized what was happening. The code team would take for minutes to assemble. He had maybe 2. Pericardial tamponade. The missed fragment, a piece of whatever had punctured him during the fall, had shifted with Marsh's movement, tearing deeper into the sac surrounding his heart. His heart was drowning in its own blood. Every beat forced more fluid into that tight space until the ventricles couldn't fill anymore. Pressure built. The pump failed. The numbers on the monitor didn't lie, heart rate climbing past 130, blood pressure collapsing toward shock. Katie shoved the code cart aside. She didn't ask permission. Her hand found a 10-blade scalpel from the instrument tray beside his bed. The equipment had been there all along, waiting, and she moved with a fluidity that didn't belong in Seattle General. The ribs came into focus. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her fingers found it without hesitation. The scalpel went in at an angle, muscle memory driving her hands like someone else was moving them. Blood. The hiss of air escaping compressed lung tissue. A thoracotomy performed in a hospital bed with one hand steady on his chest and the other working with the precision of someone who'd done this in darkness, in helicopters, in conditions that would have broken anyone else. The resident froze in the doorway. 2 nurses stepped back as if the room had changed pressure. Katie's voice dropped an octave. Forceps. Satin sky clamp. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command that moved people without thought. The resident found himself handing her instruments before his brain caught up to what he was doing. She worked the bleeder, clamping it with movements that looked like dance, like violence, like salvation. Her voice continued, steady, precise, without the deference that had marked every other interaction in this hospital. Type and cross for 2 units. Get me a chest tube, 28 French. Someone call cardiothoracic and tell them I need them in ICU in 90 seconds, not 10 minutes. Yes, Captain, the resident said. Then his face went white. He hadn't known why he'd said that. It just came out. As if her hands had reminded everyone in the room of a rank she'd never claimed. The bleeding stopped. Marsh's blood pressure climbed, 65, 75, 88. His oxygen saturation rose. His color returned. Katie closed the incision with the same calm precision, her fingers moving through knots and sutures like a woman who'd stitched soldiers back together on stretchers under fire. The whole thing took for minutes and 30 seconds. By the time the code team arrived, Captain Marsh was stable. By the time the trauma surgeon pushed through the crowd, Katie was already stepping back, peeling off gloves, her face revealing nothing. The surgeon looked at the closed incision, at the patient's improving vitals, at the bloody tray beside the bed. He looked at Katie. Who performed that? Nobody answered. Nobody moved. The room had a quality to it now, a thickness, like the air itself had changed density. But Dr. Pierce had arrived. He stood in the doorway, his face registering the scene in stages, first confusion, then recognition of Katie at the center of it, then something colder. Calculation. He'd seen what she'd done. He'd seen her do it. And in that moment, whatever remained of his hesitation crystallized into certainty. She was a threat, and threats required elimination. He didn't speak. He turned and walked back down the hallway, and Katie watched him go with the same flat expression she'd worn for 2 years. She knew what came next. She'd always known. The question was only timing, and Dr. Pierce was a man who understood paperwork better than scalpels. He understood the weapon that institutional authority could become. The cardiac surgeon returned to ICU 37 minutes later, his expression caught between disbelief and gratitude. He reviewed her closure, her technique, her decision-making. Whoever performed that field thoracotomy, he said quietly, bought this man the time his heart needed. I don't know your protocols here, but that was, he stopped. He was looking at her hands. Not her face. Just her hands. The way they rested at her sides with the confidence of someone who'd saved lives in places hospitals couldn't reach. That was extraordinary work. Katie nodded once. He was crashing. There wasn't time. There never is, the surgeon said. Then he left. Dr. Pierce was already in motion. Within the hour, the medical board had received a formal emergency complaint. Within 90 minutes, the hospital's legal team was circulating documents that filled a folder 3 inches thick. Patient consent violations. Scope of practice exceeded. Unauthorized surgical intervention performed by a nurse without physician authorization. Reckless endangerment of a patient. He'd weaponized the same regulations that existed for good reason and turned them into precision instruments against her. The papers were meticulous. The timing was impeccable. He'd prepared for this contingency the moment he'd seen her competence. At 4:15 p.m., during shift change, hospital security arrived at the nurse's station. Katie was completing her charts, the patient's vitals documented in her careful handwriting. The senior guard, an older man with tired eyes who'd never had to do this before, approached quietly. Nurse Morrison, you need to come with us. He didn't say she was fired. He didn't say anything. He just held out his hand, and in his other hand was her badge, already deactivated, the magnetic strip purposeless. Every head in the ER turned. She didn't flinch. She didn't protest. She logged out of the computer, folded her hands, and stood. The walk through the emergency department lasted forever and no time at all. Past the trauma bay where she'd worked at GSW last month and brought a man back from death. Past the break room where the nurses stopped talking the moment she entered. Past Dr. Pierce's office, where he stood with arms crossed and expression satisfied, finally vindicated by paperwork and bureaucracy and the simple fact that credentials still mattered more than competence. The elevator ride was silent. The drive home in the security vehicle was silent. Katie sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face revealing nothing, while the city blurred past the windows. 3 hours ago she'd been a nurse at Seattle General. Now she was a former employee with a legal file and a parking lot dismissal. She arrived home at 5:32 p.m. The house was quiet. Emma wouldn't be back from her grandmother's until tomorrow morning. Katie sat at the kitchen table with discharge papers spread across the surface like evidence. Legal notices. A termination letter citing scope of practice violations. The hospital's statement that she was no longer employed as of 4:15 p.m. She opened the hall closet and reached to the back, behind the winter coats and emergency supplies, until her fingers found the wooden box she hadn't opened in 15 years. The folded flag sat heavy in her hands. The stars faced outward. The red and white stripes were military folds, perfect, precise, the way Jackson's family had received it at his funeral, the way she'd brought it home and locked it away with everything else she'd been ordered to forget. Sergeant David Jackson, 75th Ranger Regiment Special Operations Surgical Team, KIA Hindu Kush, Operation Ghost Line, classified, erased, never existed. Katie set the flag box on the kitchen table. At 5:08 p.m., the first tear fell. Not from shock. Not from fear of unemployment or legal battles or the destruction of her civilian identity. The tears came because she'd almost believed it. For 2 years she'd almost convinced herself that Katie Morrison, community college nurse, was real. That the scars on her hands were from accidents, not shrapnel. That the muscle memory in her fingers was just good training, not the echo of 17 field surgeries and 48 hours of continuous surgery under enemy fire. That Sergeant Jackson's blood had washed off and she could be normal and her daughter could grow up with a mother who'd never seen what she'd seen. Dr. Pierce had destroyed the fiction. Not by finding out who she was, but by reminding her that competence made you dangerous, and dangerous people got erased. At 6:08 p.m., Emma's grandmother called. "Katie, honey, Emma's asking if she can stay another night. She's so happy playing with the cousins." Is that? Katie heard her daughter's voice in the background, laughing about something, innocent and alive and safe. She closed her eyes. "That's fine," Katie said. Her voice sounded normal. "She can stay." She hung up and sat at the table while darkness fell outside, the folded flag box in front of her, her hands resting on the surface like evidence of a war that no longer officially occurred. The security guard's walkie-talkie crackled at 4:48 p.m. as Katie walked toward the parking lot, her badge already deactivated, the small plastic rectangle deadweight in her pocket. No one looked at her. That was the strange part. Not hostile looks, not whispered comments, just the absence of anything. She had become invisible the moment Dr. Pierce had signed the paperwork. The glass doors slid open with a soft hiss. Rain hammered the asphalt like applause for a performance no one wanted to witness. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply walked to her car, sat in the driver's seat, and gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white as bone. 3 hours later, she sat at her kitchen table in the dark. The folded flag box sat in front of her, the triangle of woolen stars that represented Jackson Chen, her medic in the Hindu Kush, the man who had died covering her extraction from a landing zone that the Pentagon claimed never existed. She had stared at that flag for 15 years. 15 years of a life erased. 15 years of pretending she was just a community college nurse in a civilian hospital, her hands steady because she'd already held the worst. Her jaw had been tight. Her breathing controlled. All the composure of someone who had seen things that left scars you couldn't explain on a job application. The kitchen light flicked on. Emma stood in the doorway in her purple pajamas, her small face creased with confusion. 8 years old. 8 years of being her daughter's entire world, and Katie had never told her why Mommy sometimes woke up gasping, why certain sounds made her flinch, why there was a folded flag in the bedroom closet that Katie touched like a prayer. "Mommy." Emma's voice was small. Uncertain. "Why are you home early?" Katie's hands were resting on the table. Scarred hands. Hands that had performed 17 field surgeries under enemy fire. Hands that had clamped a bleeder while rounds punched through the canvas above her head. Hands that had held the dying in a war that had been legally erased the moment the generals needed her to disappear. She couldn't explain any of it. Not to an 8-year-old who just wanted her mother to be normal. She reached out, pulled Emma close, and the child wrapped her arms around Katie's neck with the complete trust of someone who had never learned that the world could betray you. Katie pressed her forehead against Emma's shoulder and finally let the trembling come, silent tears that Emma felt but didn't understand, that made her ask Mommy, "Are you okay?" in a voice that broke Katie into pieces she didn't know how to reassemble. The next morning, Katie's phone rang at 8:13 a.m. A Marine colonel with a voice like a tank idling in a garage asked for Captain Morrison. Katie's hands went numb. Emma was at school. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator's mechanical hum and the sound of Katie's own breathing, suddenly too loud, too fast. "This is she," Katie said. 10 seconds. That's all it took to crack the seal on 15 years. By 10:41 a.m., the colonel stood in Seattle General's main hallway, his dress uniform crisp as broken glass, his bearing carrying the weight of command. Dr. Pierce watched from 10 feet away, his smirk firmly in place, clearly convinced this was some administrative error, some mistaken identity that would evaporate within minutes. The colonel approached the nursing station where Katie stood organizing trauma charts, her back to him, her voice steady as he said, "Captain Morrison, I'm Colonel James Halloway, 75th Ranger Regiment. I'm here with orders regarding Operation Ghostline." The room went dead silent. Not the absence of sound, the presence of something heavier. Oxygen seemed to leave the air. Katie turned slowly, and everyone in that hallway saw her face change. Not visibly. Not to most people. But her eyes shifted from the cautious brown of a survivor to something harder, colder, the eyes of someone who had made life-or-death decisions while the world slept. She extended her hand and the colonel took it, his grip firm, respectful. Dr. Pierce's smirk faded. That's when the ranger patient, Captain Ryan Marsh, his breathing still slightly shallow from his collapsed lung, called out from his room in a voice that carried like a command, "Phantom." Everyone turned. Marsh was sitting up, his foreline tugging slightly as he moved, and his eyes were locked on Katie with a recognition that made the entire hallway recalibrate what they were looking at. The security camera footage would later show the exact moment the staff realized they'd been wrong about everything. The moment a community college nurse became a classified operative simply because a man they'd tried to destroy had spoken her name aloud. The elevator doors opened at 11:02 a.m. A two-star general stepped out with 2 aides in dress uniform, and the hallway compressed. The general walked directly to Katie, and in front of 37 hospital staff members, he rendered a crisp salute. Fist to chest. The gesture of a superior officer honoring the service of someone beneath his rank. Katie returned the salute with precision that made several nurses gasp. "Captain Morrison," the general said, his voice carrying the weight of institutional power, "the Pentagon has declassified Operation Ghostline specifically to prevent this injustice. Your service record, your valor, your sacrifice, it's now part of the official record. No more shadows. No more erasure." Dr. Pierce had gone pale. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked around at the gathering crowd, nurses who had participated in his campaign to isolate her, who had pretended not to see her in break rooms, who had whispered about just a community college nurse, now stood frozen as the weight of their complicity settled on their shoulders like snow. A Pentagon liaison in a charcoal suit approached Dr. Pierce with a folder. The man's expression was professional, which somehow made it worse. He opened the folder and Dr. Pierce saw his own face on the security footage, his voice clear and cutting as he humiliated Katie in front of a gunshot victim's weeping parents. His break room comments, recorded by the hospital's security system. His performance write-up, the 18 procedural deviations that he had weaponized like a knife. Everything. All of it documented. All of it sent to the medical board. All of it already in the inbox of Dr. Raymond Pierce Sr., his mentor, his hero, the Ivy League god whose approval had shaped every decision Pierce had made for 23 years. By 2:27 p.m., the email was public. A trending Twitter thread. A medical blog had picked it up. Dr. Raymond Pierce Sr. had issued a public statement, "I am deeply disappointed and ashamed of my former protégé's conduct. His behavior violated every principle I taught him about compassion and professional integrity. I am personally requesting the medical board pursue the fullest extent of ethics investigation possible." The statement carried weight because Raymond Pierce Sr. carried weight, 42 years of impeccable credentials, published research, hospital board positions. His disavowal of his own mentee was a guillotine falling in slow motion. The hospital CEO called an emergency board review for 4:33 p.m. 7 minutes. That's all the meeting lasted. Security escorts were already waiting outside Dr. Pierce's office by 4:15. His hospital credentials were suspended pending investigation. His badge was deactivated. His office was being packed into cardboard boxes while staff members walked past with their eyes fixed on walls, on floors, on anything except the sight of a man who had wielded institutional power like a weapon, now watching that power dissolve like morning mist. Katie stood in the hallway with Captain Marsh at her side, both of them in their military bearing, both of them framed by the fluorescent lights that suddenly seemed less harsh now, less accusatory. The general had already left, his aides trailing behind him, the machinery of the Pentagon satisfied that its instrument had been protected, that its erased warrior had been restored. But Katie remained, and when she looked at the staff filing past her, her expression carried no triumph. No vindication. Just the calm competence of someone who had already survived the worst the world could offer. "I'm going on break," she said to Marsh, her voice dry as desert sand. "Need some Jell-O before I review the next patient chart." Two nurses heard it and actually laughed, the kind of laugh that releases pressure, that acknowledges they had just witnessed something seismic shift beneath the ordinary floor of an ordinary hospital. Katie walked toward the break room, her footsteps echoing, her scarred hands steady as they had always been, her daughter's face swimming in her mind, waiting to be told that Mommy's story was finally allowed to be told. The folded flag box would no longer need to hide in a closet. The classified mission was declassified. Operation Ghostline had a name. And a woman who had performed 17 surgeries under enemy fire, who had disappeared because her country asked her to, who had spent 15 years as a phantom in plain sight, finally had permission to be real. If you're watching this, you've just witnessed a story about hidden strength, about the quietest person in the room sometimes being the one holding it all together. Subscribe to see more stories about people who've survived impossible things. Like this video if you believe that true valor doesn't always wear a uniform, sometimes it wears scrubs. And comment, what would you have done if you'd been standing in that hallway when the truth walked through those elevator doors? The answer to that question says everything about who you are.